So good morning or good afternoon, if one is in the Holy Land, and welcome to this Israel Advocacy IAC Committee presentation for B'nai Israel. I'm Rabbi Eric Polikoff, and on behalf of our IAC committee, I'm delighted to welcome us all, and thrilled to have Elliot Glassenberg, who will be introduced momentarily, as our speaker this morning. I just wanted to, and hopefully we'll hear a little bit Elliot's perspective about what's happening in Israel right now. But then really we're so excited to learn about his work and the work of Jews of a secular orientation and their discovery of Jewish learning, Jewish values, and their influence. I would remind those who have not had an opportunity yet to go to the latest Pew Research study, which you'll find on the JTA and other places, of the extensive number of the younger generation of millennials and coming up in Generation X, who don't specifically identify with a denomination or a movement or religious orientation within the Jewish community. And so for us as Americans, and looking at our need to reach out to that next generation, and for us as Zionists, this makes this presentation so important to us. And I see that Elliot has just put into the chat a link to that study. Its implications are very important to us. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Dan Goodman of our IAC to introduce our speaker.
Good morning. So Elliot Glassenberg is a senior educator at BINA, the Jewish Movement for Social Change. Elliot is a leading activist for refugee rights in Israel. Elliot is a blogger for the Times of Israel and has published in Haaretz. His educator activist approach focuses on the application of Judaism for social change. Elliot, thank you.
Toda rabba. Thank you very much for having me. Shavua tov, everyone. So the topic today is Israeli secular Jewish Renaissance. What is it and what can we learn from it? You know, it's funny, when I use the word we, sometimes I refer to we Israelis, sometimes I refer to we American Jews, sometimes I just refer to we Jews in general, and it's convenient. I'll tell you a little bit more about my personal story beyond just kind of like the important sounding things in my bio. So as you can maybe tell from my accent, I'm not originally from Israel. I'm from a small town called Chicago. Maybe you've heard of it. And I'll tell you like how I found my way to the Israeli secular cultural renaissance as an American-born Jew. Can I just ask that we maybe mute people who aren't?
So Elliot, please now unmute yourself. I just muted everybody. So
there we go.
There you go.
Great. Feel free to I've been living in Israel the last 10 years. I'm used to people interrupting, including on Zoom. So feel free, if you have a question or comment or disagreement, just go ahead and unmute yourself and jump right in. So I grew up on what I like to call a Refo Conservadox home in Chicago, somewhere between Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox, depending on the day of the week and who was asking. I remember my family, a typical Shabbat in our family was we would walk to synagogue on Shabbat morning in Chicago in the snow, uphill both ways. And then we would come home and we would watch Jewish movies that we had rented. So on one hand, for me, Judaism is going to synagogue and being together with community and prayer and studying Torah. But Judaism is also Jewish stories and movies and food. Culture and religion was all kind of mixed together in my family. And the first time I visited Israel was for my brother's bar mitzvah. So he was turning 13, I was turning 11, and we spent a month in Israel. And I felt at home for so many different reasons, but largely because there in Israel, Judaism wasn't just the culture of the synagogue or my Jewish school. Judaism was everywhere. It was in the food, in the protests, in the streets, in the advertisements, in the comedy on TV. Jewish culture was just everywhere. And it wasn't just religion. Yes, Jewish religion is thriving, but there's so much more to Judaism. And right away, I felt at home. It took me, when I was 10 years old, I decided I was making Aliyah. It took me another 18 years to actually find my way to Israel. I lived in New York for a number of years. I lived in Montreal for a number of years. I taught at a Jewish school. And then when I was 27 years old, I had my quarter life crisis. And I decided I needed to come spend a year living in Israel, not just visiting in Israel. And that's how I found my way to BINA, where I now work. I came to just spend a year studying and volunteering at BINA, which is one of the hubs of secular Israeli Jewish culture and learning in Israel. I'll say a word about BINA. BINA is the Jewish Movement for Social Change. BINA started as a project of the kibbutz movement in the year 1996, right after the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, actually, by a group of people in the kibbutz movement who said, listen, like when the kibbutz movement was founded, it was meant to be a home for secular Jewish culture. Over time, they felt like in Israel had become more divided between the Jewish Israelis and like the secular Israelis. And more religious Jewish Israelis were involved in studying Judaism and Jewish culture, and more secular Jewish Israelis were disengaging from Jewish culture and values. And that really became very clear, especially in the 1990s. And around at the time of the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, and especially afterwards, there were many secular identified Israelis who wanted to reconnect to Judaism, who wanted to learn more about Judaism, who wanted to be a part of the Jewish discourse in Israel. And they came together to study. And very quickly, they realized it wasn't enough just to study. They wanted to also do action. So they started doing volunteer work together and educating others. And that's how BINA came to be. But on one foot, BINA reaches about 100,000 Israelis every year, including people who come to us to spend a year or a summer studying and volunteering. And we also go to Israeli public schools and Israeli army units to teach about Judaism from a secular cultural perspective. And so today I identify as a secular cultural reformed Orthodox Jew. I'm a member of a conservative synagogue in Israel and a reform synagogue in Israel. And I teach at BINA at one of our institutions that we call a secular yeshiva in Tel Aviv. That's kind of who I am and what I do. I teach about the intersection of Judaism and social justice. And when I can, I try to use Judaism as a tool for advocating for human rights in Israel and beyond. So what I want to do is I want to give like a little bit of background. What is this whole secular cultural renaissance happening in Israel? And what does it have to do with American Jews? I'll just maybe pause now if we have any like questions or comments or arguments or relevant Jewish jokes before I continue. Okay, I'm going to dive in, but like I said, feel free to interrupt. Do I have the possibility to share my screen? I do. Amazing. All right, let me adjust my settings so I can see everyone. Oops. Okay, I told you my story. I want to give you a little bit of background to this thing that we call the Hitchadshut Yehudit, the Jewish renewal or renaissance in Israel. Where are we today? Why it's important, and then what do I think is next, both for Israeli Jews and American Jews, and why these things are interconnected. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the background of the Israeli secular Jewish renaissance. Now, in this very simple diagram, the Israeli secular Jewish renaissance, people have been talking about it a lot over the last 10, 15, 20 years, this renaissance of culture in Israel and secular Israelis studying Judaism and creating Judaism from new perspectives, new art and new books and new music. But in order to understand this renaissance, you have to go back more than 20 years. You have to go back 120 years, 140 years, 150 years to the beginning of modernity in Zionism. And I think it's important to understand Zionism, especially secular Zionism and secular cultural Zionism, within the broader framework of modernity. And I don't have 3 hours to give a full lecture on Jewish history and sociology, but pretty much I see all of these different phenomena, modern Jewish phenomena, as different outcomes, responses, Jewish responses to modernity, right? How did modernity affect the Jews? In a lot of different ways. We have enlightenment, or what we call in Hebrew the haskalah, scientific and critical understanding of religion and the world, emancipation, Jews getting citizenship, Jews getting equal rights, at least on paper, in many parts of the world. The rise of nationalism. Where do Jews fit into nationalism? Are we proud Frenchmen and French women? Are we Americans, or is Judaism our nationalism? All these questions led to many, many different answers, right? You have two Jews, you have three opinions, right? One response was ultra-Orthodoxy, which is absolute separation. But then next to Orthodoxy, we have other forms of modern denominations with a response to modernity, modern Orthodox, conservative, reform, cultural, socialist, Judaism like Bundism, and then we have Zionism, and within Zionism, religious Zionism and secular Zionism. Just a word about Zionism. When a lot of people think about Zionism, they think about this guy. Who's this guy? Oh, wait, does it say at the top? It does. Oh, I can't hide that. Okay. Well, Theodor Herzl, who is a founder of modern political Zionism, right? And he's remembered as being the visionary of the Jewish state, right? He said what we need is sovereignty over a portion of land. But a lot of people don't know that Herzl didn't just stop there, right? Everybody reads this booklet called The Jewish State, but they often don't read the other booklet that he wrote, Alt Neuland, Old New Land, in which he had this kind of utopian vision for what a Jewish society would look like. And he said, it is true that we aspire to our ancient land, but what we want in that ancient land is a new blossoming of the Jewish spirit. And this was a big part of what Zionism was for many people. Most people haven't heard of Ahad Ha'am, but he was a leader of Zionism, I think, just as important as Theodor Herzl. And he said a lot. Well, I'm not going to give you the whole, spiel. You should go Google Ahad Ha'am and read about him if you haven't learned about Ahad Ha'am. But what he said, and he was a big, I guess one could say, rival of Herzl's. They agreed on some things, they disagreed on a lot. And he was a major critic of Herzl's. And he said, Judaism needs at present but little. He said, it needs not an independent state, but the creation in its native land of conditions favorable to its development. A good-sized settlement of Jews working without hindrance in every branch of culture, from agriculture and handicrafts to science and literature. And when our national culture in Palestine, land of Israel, has attained that level, it will produce men in that country who will be able to establish that will be a Jewish state, not merely a state of Jews, right? So from the very beginning, Zionism wasn't just about migration, moving Jews from point A to point B. Zionism was also about transformation, transforming what it means to be Jewish, just like the world was around us being transformed. All right, fast forward. No. I always get confused because some computers go right to left with the buttons, some go left to right. Okay. Many have heard of the Hebrew poet Chaim Bialik. He wrote so many books and literature, and Shai Agnon. And these were, secular Jewish authors. But to be secular Jewish authors didn't mean they weren't engaging with Jewish religion. It means they very much were engaging with Jewish religion and sources, but in their own secular cultural way. Over the years, we've seen many different, for example, Haggadot written by different kibbutzim that took maybe some of the traditional liturgy, but add new liturgy connecting to the Zionist movement. They saw Zionism as a continuation of the redemption and the Exodus from Egypt. Okay, fast forward. Finally, the state is established. Yay, Mazel Tov. When the state is established, Ben-Gurion, on one hand, was a visionary, but on one hand, he was a pragmatist. He needed to build a country, and he needed to get the agreement with as many Jews as possible, which, as everybody here knows, I'm sure was not very easy. So when the state was established, he agreed to what was called the status quo agreement. Though the religious Zionists wanted to make the state more religious towards the direction of theocracy, the secular Zionists wanted to make the state more of a secular state. Ben-Gurion pretty much said, we're just going to keep things the way they are now under the British mandate. And one of the ways that things existed under the British mandate was Jewish education. and you had independent school streams. You had the Haredi, the ultra-Orthodox education system, the Mamlachti Dati, the religious Zionist education system, and the Mamlachti, like the secular Zionist education system. And each of these systems remained separate and state-funded after the establishment of the Jewish state. The result of that, the unfortunate result of that being, when you fast forward many generations, we realize that in the religious Zionist school system, they learned about Talmud and Jewish history and Jewish philosophy and Jewish law. In the secular Zionist school system, Israelis learned about history and math and science, and they learned about maybe some Bible stories, some Tanakh, but they didn't learn about Talmud. They didn't learn about the evolution of Jewish culture. Now, though many of the people that built the state of Israel, like Ben Gurion, like Bialik, like Ahad Am, grew up entrenched in Jewish knowledge and culture and broke away from it, many of their children were not. Yaakov Chazan, who was a writer and actually one of the first Knesset members in Israel, he saw this problem right away at the beginning of the state. He warned, he said, we wanted to raise a generation of heretics, but instead we raised a generation of ignorant Jews, right? They had this vision for, we're going to raise these generations and generations of Jews who know Judaism, who know Jewish sources, but are constantly rebelling against it. I think in some cases that was true. I think the kibbutzim did manage to preserve that, but outside of kibbutzim, I think the average Israeli or secular Israeli raised in the average Israeli secular school, they just didn't know much about Judaism. They knew a lot about Zionism and the history of Zionism and the establishment of Israel, but they didn't really know what the Zionists were rebelling against. Fast forward several more generations, and you have these deep divisions in Israel between those that have been raised with Jewish knowledge and learning and those that have been raised with secular Zionist knowledge and learning. And in the 1990s, there was suddenly there was a feeling that there was going to be, with the Oslo process, there was this feeling that peace was coming. Suddenly, all these challenges and questions that had been kind of shoved under the rug for 50 years started bubbling to the surface. Tensions between religious and secular Jewish Israelis, questions of what does it mean to be a Jewish state started bubbling up, and questions of religion and state and marriage and divorce and conversion started coming to the forefront of Israeli headlines. And Rabin forefront. There was a lot of talk about how the religious in Israel, or specifically the Orthodox establishment in Israel, had hijacked Judaism, had taken Judaism away from everyone, had built this monopoly on Judaism. Over time, the discourse has changed to more one of shared responsibility. A lot of secular Israelis say, listen, we secular Israelis, we sold our stocks in Judaism. We were focused on secular aspects of Zionism, and we didn't engage in Jewish learning and Jewish expression and Jewish practice. We let the Orthodox Israelis handle it. And now many secular Israelis want to buy those stocks back. They want to engage in Jewish learning on their own terms. And many religious Israelis are very happy with that. They're happy to share the Torah, although there are some that are not happy to share the Torah. One key turning point was the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin in November of 1995, when the secular, progressive, pro-peace Prime Minister of Israel, who was kind of this hero of secular Israelis, was assassinated by a religious right-wing Israeli. That really was a peak of tension in Israel. Now, there were religious Israelis who supported Rabin, and there were secular Israelis who did not support Rabin. But for the most part, there was this feeling that Israel was being divided in two camps, one that supported peace in the name of humanism and universal secular values, and one camp that opposed peace in the name of Judaism and Jewish values. And when the prime minister was assassinated by a religious Jew, supposedly in the name of Jewish values, many secular Israelis said, whoa, 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 I want nothing to do with this Judaism thing. These aren't my values. But there was this slowly building quiet countercultural movement of secular Israelis who said, okay, that is not my Judaism, but I know there must be more to Judaism than that. Now I need to go and study it for myself in order to be able to find it. So already in the 1990s, you had these new initiatives like BINA, that's our old logo, Sav Pius, Elul, the Midrashan Oranim of secular Israelis, sometimes together with religious Israelis, sometimes on their own, coming to study Judaism, to do Jewish practice, celebrate holidays together, not in a traditional religious Orthodox way, but on their own terms. Okay, new books were written like Ari Elon. He was one of the founders of BINA, and he wrote this book that was one of the few books of the Israeli secular Renaissance that's been translated into English, From Jerusalem to the Edge of Heaven. Actually translated by the late Tikva Freimer Kensky, who is the Rebbitzin of the synagogue that I grew up in Wilmette, Illinois, Beth Hillel. All right, I'm going to skip over some of these quotes. What we see today, so what started as like a small movement in the 1990s is a movement that now has hundreds of thousands of Israelis involved, dozens of artists and musicians and dozens of different organizations that are either engaged in Jewish learning or Jewish culture or Jewish creativity or Jewish arts have flourished in Israel. This has started to trickle more into the realm of politics. And I think, what's on a lot of people's mind in Israel, or at least what makes what CNN is, Israeli-Palestinian politics, the conflict, right versus left. But underneath so much of that in Israel are the politics of religion and identity. Who gets to decide what it means to be a Jewish state, how you get married in Israel, how you celebrate Shabbat in Israel. And these are issues that affect the day-to-day lives of Israelis of all religious backgrounds that don't necessarily make the headlines. Since the 2000s, we've seen major waves of protests of Israelis challenging the status quo, both the status quo with regards to social justice issues in Israel, status quo related to LGBT rights in Israel, and the status quo related to religion and state in Israel. This is from 2013. Ruth Calderon, she was elected member of Knesset through the Yesh Atid party, and she herself was the founder of Alma, which was a partner of BINA, one of these secular cultural Israeli movements. And she herself has a doctorate in Talmud, is a Talmud teacher, grew up secular. And when she gave her maiden speech in the Knesset, her opening speech at the Knesset, she took the first 10 minutes to teach some Talmud in the Knesset. Here we have a secular woman teaching Talmud in the Knesset. And then she ended her speech with a message. I just want to share like 30 seconds of her speech. It's about 8 years old, but it's very relevant today. See if this works. It's in Hebrew with English captions.
אני שואפת להביא למצב בו לימוד התורה יהיה נחלת כל ישראל, מבחינת תורה מונחת בקרן זווית, וכל מי שרוצה ליטול יבוא וייטול. שכל אזרחי ישראל הצעירים ייקחו חלק בנטל, גם בלימוד תורה וגם בשירות צבאי ואזרחי, וביחד ייבנה הבית ולא תחלש הדעת. אני שואפת ליום בו משאבי המדינה יחולקו בהוגנות ובשוויון לכל תלמיד ותלמידת חכמים, על פי איכות לימודם ולא על פי שיוכם הציבורי. שבתי המדרש, הארגונים והישיבות החילוניות והפלורליסטיות יזכו לתמיכה שווה והוגנת מול בתי המדרש האורתודוקסיים והחרדיים, ומתוך קנאת הסופרים והתחרות הבריאה תגדל התורה ותאדיר. אני מבקשת להזכיר.
One second. Next slide. Oops. Okay. So that was 7-8 years ago. We've made some progress in getting a little bit more funding and recognition for the secular cultural movement in Israel. A lot of that has been due to more and more Israelis getting involved in this movement, and also due to the support of North American Jews supporting Jewish pluralism in Israel. Again, in the 1990s, we saw a lot of support of American Jews for Jewish denominations in Israel, Reform, Conservative, Reconstructionist Judaism in Israel, which is wonderful. But I think American Jewish leadership has also started to realize, listen, most secular Israelis are never going to go to a Reform or Conservative or Reconstructionist synagogue because they don't want to go to a synagogue in the first place. They're interested in other approaches to Judaism, maybe a Beit Midrash, maybe a yeshiva, maybe a community center that just has Jewish holidays and learning. But still, it's still an uphill battle, though actually today, I had a meeting at BINA with Rabbi Gilad Kariv, Rabbi and lawyer Gilad Kariv, for many years has been the head of the Reform movement in Israel, who was just elected to the Knesset as part of the Labor Party. And I'm fairly optimistic that he's going to be able to help make some progress on this front. So we'll see. All right, I just want to talk a little bit about like where we are today and how this relates to American Jews. So Rabbi Polakov mentioned the new Pew study. I just want to bring in like a few really interesting statistics looking at some of the differences, but incredibly some of the similarities between American and Israeli Jews, especially young generations of American and Israeli Jews in terms of how they identify and what's important to them. So one thing that we see is the vast majority of Jews in Israel and in America, including those who identify as secular or Reform or unaffiliated, are proud to be Jewish. Right? In Israel, 91% of non-Orthodox Jews identify as proud or very proud to be Jewish. 94% of people who identify as Jewish and American, right, are very proud to be Jewish, even though fewer than half of them are affiliated with synagogues. Okay. But of course, even though on the outside, the categories are a little bit different, right? In America, we have Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, Omai, right? Other branches, Renewal, Reconstructionist, Chavarav movement, no particular branch. And in Israel, of course, we have Haredi, which is usually translated as Orthodox, Dati, which is usually translated as modern Orthodox or national religious, Masorti, which is translated as traditional. And of course, the biggest group is Chiloni, secular or unaffiliated. It was really interesting, if we look at the youngest cohort of American Jews, those between the ages of 18 to 29, the largest group, 41%, don't identify with any of the denominations. They would probably be the closest to the secular Israelis. Chiloni, they identify as Jewish, are proud to be Jewish, but they don't really fit into any of the traditional boxes. I would even argue that many young Jews today, many of my peers and people younger than them who use the label Reform means they identify with the values of Reform Judaism, but they don't necessarily affiliate with a Reform synagogue or with the Reform community. So I would say there's a lot in common between these unaffiliated American Jews and Reform American Jews, and possibly also some conservative, even modern Orthodox Jews with this chunk of Israelis. Something that's very interesting and is growing with time, more and more Israeli Jews as well as American Jews see Judaism less as religion and more as a matter of culture, ancestry. Something that's fascinating statistic, look at the bottom line here. So these are looking at non-Orthodox Jews in Israel and non-Orthodox Jews in America. The numbers are almost exactly the same. This is from actually the last Pew survey from 2013, but the numbers are still similar in the new survey. 68% of non-Orthodox US Jews and Israeli Jews see Judaism primarily as a matter of culture or ancestry. 21% see it as a combination of religion and culture. Only about 11% see Judaism as primarily a religion. All right, more statistics. But I do want to point out, even though many Israelis identify as Chiloni, as secular, 54% of Chiloni Israelis said that Jewish education is somewhat important or very important for them and their children and their families. This is actually a survey that nobody is talking about, but is fascinating. The survey of Canadian Jews that was done 2 years ago along similar lines. This is a question that I'm surprised they didn't ask to American Jews. They said, okay, we know a lot of people aren't coming to synagogues. What do people want? What kinds of Jewish programming are people interested in? And they asked this as an open question, not multiple choice. what kind of Jewish programs or activities would you be interested in? About 24% of people said they would be interested in more educational programs. 20%, 19% said cultural programs, social programs. So this is something that we're seeing on both sides of the ocean. Jews are interested in Judaism as a culture. Now, as somebody who grew up kind of with both, right, with synagogue life as well as cultural Judaism, a part of my heart like kind of breaks a little bit, especially when I visit my parents' synagogues and I see there are fewer young people there than there used to be. And it's sad to see, but it's also really cool when you go to JCCs, you go to Jewish cultural events, you still see a lot of young Jews actively involved. Their involvement just looks a little bit different. So some of the things that I've learned from the past 10 years that I've been in Israel in terms of what does work in reaching out to these new generations of Jews. The first thing I noticed is radical inclusion. You need to meet people where they are. As Muki Tzor, one of the founders of BINA, says, listen, we can have all these conversations about Judaism, but we need to talk about Jews, because without Jews, there is no Judaism. And Jews today look different and think different than they did when I was growing up, when my parents are growing up, when my grandparents are growing up. And they're interested in different things. And if we want Judaism to survive and stay alive, we have to meet them where they are. And very often that's outside of the synagogue. Emphasis on culture. As we saw, many Jews are proud to be Jewish, want to be Jewish, but Judaism to them isn't necessarily about religion in a traditional sense. I mean, even a synagogue for many of us isn't just about religion, but for some people it is. And another thing I think we need to think about is why. This is, I think, one of the biggest questions that we're not talking about enough, and these demographic surveys don't explore enough. A lot of young Jews are choosing not to be involved in Judaism in America and in Israel. In Israel, it means a lot of Jews, young secular Jews, are leaving Israel and moving to Europe, moving to America, and they may or may not keep a connection with Jewish community. And a lot of young American Jews are choosing not to continue to engage or to raise their children as Jewish. And I think something that we need to talk about is why. Why are we Jewish? And why do we think they should be Jewish? The answer that worked for my parents and my grandparents, because that was a good enough answer for them. It's just not a good enough answer for millennials and Generation Z. For many of them, Tikkun Olam is one of those answers, Judaism as a tool for building a better world. For some, it's about creating meaningful human connections and community. I think we need to they think the answer will look different to different communities, but I think we need to at least ask that question. And this is one of the main things that I learned over the last 10 years working with both American and Israeli Jews on both sides of the ocean. We need to be connected to another, not just on an ideological level or a theoretical level, on a personal level. We need more American Jews spending time in Israel and meeting Israelis. We need more Israelis spending time in America and meeting Americans. And we need, I mean, one of the silver linings of the COVID pandemic is more mifgashim, more encounters like this happening on Zoom, realizing Israeli Jews are dealing with their own issues, American Jews are dealing with their own issues, but we have a lot of these issues in common, and we can really learn a lot and gain a lot by engaging with these things together, not just in theory, but really in practice. You know, one of the questions, one of the challenges that a lot of American Jews are worried about today, especially after the latest Pew studies, they say a lot of young American Jews are not as emotionally attached or engaged with Israel as their parents or grandparents. But one thing those surveys skip over is the little statistic that way more young Jews have actually been to Israel and have personal relationships with Israelis than their parents or grandparents. Part of this has to do with the ease of travel. Part of it has to do with birthright and programs. So even though they might not have the same ideological connection to Israel that their parents or grandparents do, they have a personal, social, cultural connection to Israel. And that's something that I think we need to build on. I'm going to stop here for questions. Stop sharing the screen. Questions, comments, arguments, jokes.
What do I press?
I did it. Just talk.
Oh, I have a question. This survey is talking about different percentages of Jews. I wonder, what's the technique by which you identify people to participate in these surveys, especially for those that are unaffiliated with any religious organization?
That's the million shekel question. There's like a whole chapter in the survey just about how they define who's a Jew and how they found people. Pretty much what they did was they send these surveys to randomized American households based on a geographic distribution, based on where they know Jews are geographically located. And they asked them many questions. And one of the questions was, do you identify as Jewish? And then based on that, they asked them further questions. Yeah. So it was based on self-identification. So there's some people who identified as Jewish in that survey that maybe certain Orthodox rabbis wouldn't say they are Jewish. But for sociological purpose, that's kind of the easiest way. If you say you're Jewish for the purpose of the survey, and we'll take it from there. I think Hadar is raising her Zoom hand. So Hadar. Oh, Hadar, you muted though. You need to mute yourself.
Well, thank you, Elliot. First of all, a wonderful presentation in condensing such a history. But I have a question that I feel a little bit, as I'm listening to you, I'm excited about this movement and I'm feeling anxious in my stomach. And I'm trying to figure out why do I feel that way? And that will be the form of the question for you. We see in America a lot, as you saw also in statistics, that young people are disengaging from synagogue and from Israel in some way or another. Forget about birthright.
Oh, Hadar, you just froze. All right, Hadar, maybe we'll come back to you. Dan, you wanted to say something or ask something?
I'm curious about, let's say, lesson 1. So I understand the concept, but how do you bridge traditional, let's say, Talmud with this secular approach? I know you can apply some moral teachings, etc., ethical, to any culture, but I'm curious how specifically the Jewish ethical concepts are translated into a secular world.
So first of all, I think the Talmud is in some ways a very secular text. The Talmud is a discussion, an open discussion, debate, and dialogue. Now, secular, not necessarily in like the secular humanistic sense, but secular in terms of like the critical thinking, questioning, you know, all bets are off kind of text. Like the world around us is changing. We're living in different times, in different places. The temple doesn't exist. Jewish sovereignty doesn't exist. We're no longer majority. We're a minority community spread all over the place. How do we live our lives? What does it mean to be Jewish? And it asks many, many questions and gives many, many different answers. And in most cases, there isn't one answer. It's a very unorthodox text. Orthodox meaning kind of like one general system. It's very kind of modern, even postmodern, where there's many different answers. So I think when we study Talmud at the secular yeshiva, it's about bringing our students into the dialogue about what it means to be Jewish in a changing reality. And I think one of the issues of the Israeli school system, I love Ben Gurion, but he was really into the Tanakh, right? They would read these Bible stories about conquering the land of Israel and what it meant to be Jewish when all the Jews were together in the land of Israel. But it doesn't have that same debate that the Talmud does. So, for example, when we study Shabbat at the secular yeshiva, we study Shabbat in the Talmud. And what does the Talmud have to say about Shabbat? But we don't, for us, it's not about teaching our students the halachot of Shabbat, what you can or cannot do on Shabbat. It's about teaching our students the questions of Shabbat. What does it mean to have a day of rest? What does it mean to build a more just society? What does it mean to build a community? How do you want to build a community? What does Shabbat look like for you? What do you think Shabbat should look like in Israel? So the culture of asking questions is something that I think is very relevant. The answers we might get to are very different than the answers that the rabbis of the Talmud have. Does that kind of answer your question, Dan?
Yes, good, thank you. I guess we've
Ruth?
lost Hadar. She may be able to log back in.
Okay.
We're kind of in the country here, all of us country bumpkins, and so internet sometimes is in and out.
Yeah, or she may be able to text me the question.
Great. Ruth, you were raising your Zoom hand. Oh, you're muted though. You have to unmute yourself, Ruth.
Myself, yeah? Am I?
Yes, now we hear you. Great.
Okay. I grew up according to Yaakov Hazan and Hashomer HaTzair, Zionism and socialism, but we were always studying the Tanakh and very aware of our Jewishness. But the thing that I think is must be brought up at BINA and other organizations is the difference between American Jews and Israelis. Is for us, Israel, being Jewish is synonymous with being an Israeli. We live Judaism in whatever form in Israel. For the American Jew, there is a bridge to be crossed in order to either understand it or identify with that kind of a way of that marries Echad Ha'am and Bialik and Herzl and Rabin. And so I think that that's a real quest. And while I think that BINA is extremely important, just to end the thought is the example of the divide is we are talking about BINA, about secular Judaism, while we just finished a war in Israel. And so that this is what Israelis identify with, how to protect ourselves, how to maintain this piece of land. And I'm sure the Talmud have said a lot about the land of Israel and about the temple and all that. But that is to me, that's the key, the deep relationship that even I, as an Israeli living for decades because of serendipitous circumstances, still feel that connection to an experience of being Israeli, which is very different than talking about quote unquote Judaism.
Yes and no. Yes to so much of that. I mean, first of all, I'm so glad that you talked about your own upbringing. I think it's really important that there's this false dichotomy saying, oh, all these secular Israelis grew up with nothing. That's not true. Right? They continue to study Tanakh in the school systems, and the kibbutzim definitely engage with these things. And the youth movements like Hashomer HaTzair definitely continue to engage in these questions. And yes, there are some major differences between the American Jewish experience and the Israeli Jewish experience, given the fact that American Jews, for the most part, are being raised in a majority non-Jewish environment, non-Jewish culture, and Israelis are being raised in an environment that is majority Jewish culture. But I think they're becoming more similar. In what ways are they becoming more similar? First of all, American Jews, being Jewish isn't automatic. It's a choice and it's a question you need to constantly think about. Why am I Jewish? Why am I continuing to do this? Why am I spending money on synagogue membership or JCC membership or a Jewish school? Right? The choices you constantly have to make. For Israelis, you don't have to think about it. I'm sending my kid to the public school. They know Hebrew. They're learning Tanakh. But I think Israeli Jews are becoming a little bit more like American Jews in terms of their Judaism. It isn't so taken for granted anymore. And their Israeliness isn't so taken for granted anymore. I think more and more, especially younger Israelis, are asking, why am I here? Why am I staying here? Why am I fighting in this army? Why am I studying these things? Why should I try to find a job here when I can more easily find a job in Silicon Valley, California, or New York? And I think without an existential or good answers to those questions, why am I continuing to choose to be Israeli or choose to be Jewish? It's going to be hard to keep them. So that's what I think Israelis can really learn from the American Jewish experience of asking those questions. This is something we definitely see among Israeli Americans, Israelis that have moved to America and, unlike you, do not associate with synagogues, but they haven't quite succeeded in transferring this identity as a choice to their children. And I think American Jews are becoming more like Israelis in terms of, yes, Judaism isn't the majority culture around them, but they don't see Judaism as a religion. They see it as a culture or a social thing or identity.
So there is a emphasis then on more of the universal values, so that it releases some of the Israeli Jews from saying, it's not that I'm not Jewish, but I'm interested in tikkun olam. I'm interested in social justice that is not necessarily defined and connected to being Israeli.
Just like young American Jews. And I think if we work together in bridging these things, we have a lot to gain. I think a lot of young American Jews are involved in social justice, but they don't think of it as a Jewish thing. I think a lot of Israeli Jews are involved in social justice. They don't think of it as a Jewish
And they
thing.
don't think about it as connected to Israel, although those demonstrating in New York, the pro-Palestinian, do think about it. If you are beholden to social justice, then you are obliged to criticize Israel.
And I think there's, I mean, we can talk about, not to get, we have Hadar's question via text in the chat, so I'll get to that. But just one more thought about that is I think, especially so many young American Jews feel like they have to kind of separate their Jewish identity and their connection to Israel with their social justice identity, but they don't realize there's millions of Israelis here in Israel that are fighting for social justice in Israel every day. And they're very proud to be Israeli, and they're very proud to be Zionist, and they might not agree with everything the government of Israel is doing, but their activism is an expression of their Jewishness and their Zionism. I think more American Jews are realizing.
This is what we did. Fight for social justice.
If more American Jews can connect with Israelis and realize, oh, we're working on the same issues: economic injustice, racial injustice, immigration, climate change. Let's work on these things together because we're working on them in Israel, in America, and around the world. All right, Hadar's question. Once I start talking about Judaism and social justice, there goes the neighborhood. How the disengagement of youth is pre-shadowing the challenging of Israel as a Jewish state, separating religion and statehood. Wait, let me read this again. I'm not entirely sure I understood the question, but I remember that Hadar was saying something about the anxiety that she's feeling about this disengagement. And I guess, I mean, that kind of goes back what Ruth and I were just talking about. And we are seeing a certain kinds of disengagement for all kinds of reasons. And I think that's scary. The disengagement from traditional modes of Jewish life, the disengagement from traditional connections to Israel. But I think our goal doesn't need to be, I don't think we should say, oh, that's it, they're disengaging, there's nothing we can do about it. I think we need to be defeatist. I also don't think we have to be too, what's it called? Regressivist about it, saying, okay, we have to get them to engage the same way we used to engage. No, I think Jewish engagement is different, and it is going to be different. And I just think we need to find the ways of helping young Jews connect to Judaism and to Israel in new ways. I think when young Jews think Judaism equals sitting in a synagogue and praying in a particular way, they're not going to want to connect to Judaism. But I think when young Jews say Judaism could be synagogue or culture or movies or volunteerism or fighting for climate change and family and community, then they might engage. I think when young Jews think having a connection with Israel means supporting Israeli government no matter what, right or wrong, then they're not going to want to engage with Israel. But I think when young Jews think, oh, engaging with Israel means having a relationship with Israelis, being involved in a conversation and discourse about culture and social justice together with Israelis my age, I think we're going to see many more people engaging. So I think this disengagement is scary and dangerous for the future of the Jewish people and for the future of Israel. But I think we need to find creative solutions to this disengagement. I hope that was your question. I hope that was an answer. Yeah, Joel.
Yeah, just a kind of a general comment. I grew up, by the way, on the south side of Chicago in a temple that was conservative, but with an Orthodox rabbi. I went to, full Hebrew school and 1 year of Hebrew high school. But, I learned about the holidays, how to dress up on Purim, but I learned very little about the history of Judaism and why I should be proud to be a Jew. I learned far more from Abba Eden's series than I ever did from Hebrew school about why I should be proud to be a Jew. And I think that's missing. And my kids haven't learned it either, I don't think. I think, Hebrew education fails miserably on that regard, at least when I was growing up.
It's so funny. Some things have changed, some things haven't changed, right? When we decide what my background is as an educator, right? When we decide what we're teaching in our Hebrew schools or what we're teaching in our synagogues, right? Do we teach what we were taught and what our parents were taught, or because this is what Jews should know? Or is it about asking the right questions, right? What should they know? What do they want to know? Why should they be Jewish? I think we should totally be learning about Jewish history in Hebrew schools. I think we should totally be learning about questions of social justice and climate change and racial justice in Hebrew school. I think especially in the day when so much information can be found in the palm of your hand in Google, I think Jewish education needs to be less about transferring information and sparking that fire to continue learning and continue engaging. And they have their whole lives to find the answers. But I think there's a balance to be found. Rabbi Palaka, if you wanted to say something, or you're just unmuted. Yeah.
Yes, and I think that I'm very proud actually of our educator. We really have transformed our curriculum over the last several years, precisely in this manner, in terms of our Holocaust education, study of civil rights, Jewish environmentalism. This year, as part of a sense of inclusivity, workshops on LGBTQ. Plus community Jews and how we from the Reform movement, or we as Reform Jews, should be relating. And we studied Jews of Africa, Jews of Asia, Jews of South America and Latin America, as a way to dispel the stereotype that all Jews, as it were, look like me. I think one of the challenges, and I'd love to get your sense of this, is, going back to the Pew study. Sorry to have it on the brain, but one of the things which we've seen in the last generation is that the organized Jewish community is also undergoing great change and tension, in that the dynamic growth and the birth rate growth is among the ultra-Orthodox, and it's among those who do not see themselves with a specific religious affiliation, the Chiloni. So what is the bridge as the center is no longer what the center was? And we have these such dynamism at the two poles, but in so many ways in direct enmity one to the other.
I think enmity might be a bit of a strong word. I mean, there definitely is enmity, but I think in most cases it's distance, lack of shared identity and understanding. Maybe because I'm a teacher educator, but I really think the solution lies in education. I think secular Israelis need to be learning more about Judaism and about different kinds of Jews. And I think Haredi Israelis need to be learning more about a secular world and secular knowledge. And I think in both communities, there is a desire. I think there's some reticence among the leadership of both communities to lose their power over their community and let their people come together. But I think that's what we need in Israel. I think the solution lies in education and meeting each other face to face. I think something that's actually really powerful is getting more Israelis to come to the diaspora, come to America and learn about American Jews, and see Orthodox, conservative, Reform Jews working together, realizing that you kind of have to when you're outside of Israel. It's a big challenge, but I think it's not too late to overcome. I just actually also want to say that's really like wonderful to hear about what your synagogue is doing. I have to say, I feel in general like the Reform movement, not in every synagogue in every corner, but I think in general the Reform movement is really trying to keep up to pace about where Jews are today and keep themselves relevant and keep their education relevant, more casting a broad net. And I really see us as partners. Like I think the secular cultural Jewish movement in Israel really aligns very muchly with the reality as well as the ideology and the values of Reform Judaism in Israel and outside of Israel. And I think we can gain a lot by doing more educational projects together, sending more Israelis to go to America and learn about Reform Judaism in America, bringing Reform Jews to Israel, getting them to learn about secular cultural Judaism in Israel. I just realized we're just about out of time, but before I forget, I just want to post in the chat. I would love to keep this conversation going. There's my email. There's also BINA's website if people want to find more resources or more learning on these topics. And I also have just like a short, like 1 minute feedback form. If you have any feedback about the session, I would love to, and BINA would love to hear it. So first of all, I want to say like, thank you very much for inviting me and having me. And thank you for being a part of this discussion. And you know, one of the things that I keep saying a lot, it's about asking the right questions. And it seems like your community is already asking some very good questions. And I definitely don't have all the answers. I have my answers, but I'm sure there are other good ones out there. So thank you for the discussion.
Thank you. Wonderful, wonderful, stimulating discussion.
Rabbi Palaka, if you're muted.
Sorry about that. Dan, will you wrap us up?
Sure. Well, I can't thank you enough. It's been kind of incubating all year. We originally had a date, and because of change in plans, you got pushed back. And then we had this little unfortunate hiccup last week, and I thought that people would be totally distracted. But Elliot, you've really taught us a lot and inspired at least me a lot. I think that we need to implement some of this. I don't know exactly how, but it's not just let's say theoretical or emotional. I think it's practical, and I thank you so much for that.
Im tirtzu en zo agada. If you will it, it is not just a dream. Theodore Herzl.
Thank you, everyone, for attending.
Thank you.
And there is a link that'll be shared to the YouTube version. If you could encourage your friends and neighbors and family who didn't attend to tune in. I think the message is clear, and the message is very, very important.
Oh, maybe I should add for the people who are on YouTube and can't see the Zoom chat, my email is Elliot, ELLIOT, @bina.org.il.
I have it. I'll send that along with the other link that you put up, Elliot.
Thank you.
Muted, Eric.
Sorry about that. For anyone who was not able, who came in late and would like to hear the beginning, just go to our YouTube channel. There are different ways of getting there. One easy way is just go to b'nai-israel-southbury.org and then follow that link, or go to YouTube and B'nai Israel Southbury, and we'll come right up, and you'll see the beginning and be able to start from the beginning. Elliot, again, thank you so much. We look forward to our next time. And I guess right before we leave our Zoom, Elliot, if I could ask you, while he's in Jaffa, he's also in a library. So if you could show your library. As you see, this is a man of great erudition, and we are truly grateful. So, toda rabah, and thanks everybody, and